We've been going through a bunch of transformations at Toast over the last couple of years, from transforming our point of sale to our support experience to onboarding. And the question I really look back at all the time is, if I would go back 2 years and give advice to myself, what would that be? And that's kind of where this talk came to be. So before I start, I want to give you a little bit of context on what Toast does. This is our mission. We empower the restaurant community to delight their guests, do what they love, and thrive. It's pretty cool. Toast is a vertical SaaS company. What that means is we go really, really deep on one domain and solve every single problem in that domain. And our domain is restaurants. The light just went a little bit lighter, which is awesome. Our domain is restaurants. So we go really deep on helping our customers, who are restaurants, solve every single problem that they're facing. And if you look at restaurants, before joining Toast, I thought restaurants really simple businesses. You know, you get the food, you do service, you follow reviews, and you're good to go. I was very, very wrong. Restaurants are not only complex businesses, they're also complex because most people go into restaurants because they love food, but they're actually really operationally difficult. They're low margins, they're high stress, high turnover industry, really, really difficult. And they're often measured by 1 or 2 interactions. How good is the food? How did you make me feel? All the things that happen in the background are kind of working over these 2 interactions. So it's a really complex business. So keep that in mind as we kind of go through this experience. So how do we approach really complex businesses? I changed control points. You're not going to hear control points to pull the thread. So just, these 2 things are the same. But if you look at a kind of a big problem, I love this saying, which is, how do you eat an elephant? Has anybody heard this before? OK. So if you've heard it before, you know what's coming next. But if you're just thinking about how do you eat an elephant, it's such a daunting question to ask. You start thinking about the size of the elephant. How do you catch the elephant? How do you, But in reality, it's just one bite at a time, like just one step at a time. If you take that concept a little bit and move it forward, and you look at this kind of very oversimplified customer journey, really, really simple customer journey. Users onboard, they use the product, they get help when they need it, and they grow. When you have 1 or 2 customers, then this is actually really your customer journey. When you have 100,000 customers with different tech-savvy levels of interacting with software, you have multiple different products, not just one. So use is actually its own customer journey for every single product. You have every problem in the support story, for example, is 100,000 different permutations depending what happened, depending on the environment, depending who's behind the phone, depending what happens in the for us, the restaurant. Then this starts to get really, really complicated. The journey starts to get really, really complex. You have more products, you have more customers, you have more problems, and you have really interesting things that you probably haven't run through before. So if you take just one piece of that and say, how do we support our customers? You start thinking of all the different problems and permutations of different problems that customers call, and again, in this case, restaurants for us, but whatever your business is, you're supporting customers as they have a problem. Just like AJ said this morning, this is one of those experiences that can fix customers' impressions of you or can derail it to the other direction. It gets really, really complicated, but it gets even more complicated as you think of all the different interactions that you can draw from customer to internal operations. So if you start drawing the customer journey, both of what customers see, but also what do you need to change internally, it starts to look even, worse is the wrong term, but it starts to look even more complex. You start thinking about, how do you train hundreds and hundreds of agents on the different products you're shipping? How do you make sure these agents are informed, but also have the context of that specific restaurant when they call in? How do you make sure they're trained on empathy, but also on the actual product and experience? How do you make sure they have the knowledge of the latest product you just shipped a week ago? How do you do that without slowing down your innovation muscle? All these problems start becoming so complex as they interact between the customer and the internal view. It kind of starts looking like this. This is why we call it pull the thread. It kind of starts looking like a ball of thread that's as daunting as the question of how do you eat an elephant? How do you unroll this ball of thread? And especially when you have a bunch of them across the experience. So we often approach it this way. We often look at this. It's a bit daunting. If you're as lucky as we are, we have an awesome research team and service design team who do wonders. How many people here have worked with a researcher this year who are not researchers? How many have worked with a service designer? All right, actually, a few. That's not bad. So we often started this way. I know not all companies do this, but we in the room often started this way. We do the customer journey, and we do it both from the view of the customer, and we do it from the view of the internal teams that support the customer, whether it's support or any other problem. And we start untangling the different experiences or the different pain points that customers face. We kind of put together the end-to-end journey that now looks a little bit less daunting than that ball of thread, and we start understanding these problems independently. And then we often make the same exact mistake of dividing and conquering. We take this holistic view that we've built from the scratch, often based on rigorous research and service design and so on, and then we discover a set of 5, 10 problems, and then we almost immediately give it to 5 or 10 teams that have not been part of that holistic view. They have actually not gone through that process end to end, and their role is now to solve one of these problems at a time. And if you think about that for a second, with a ball of thread in your mind, what happens is really different teams are pulling on that ball of thread in different directions, at different times, at different speeds, trying to solve their piece of the pie, their piece of the problem. But what they're actually doing is they're making incremental progress in their area, but they're creating more and more knots within that ball. More problems emerge, more issues the customers start facing, you start learning more, you're creating smaller thread balls within the big thread ball. And from the outside in, everything is actually improving by the metrics you've initially set. Because you're looking at the 10 projects, you have sub-teams, you have 10 project teams who are working effectively, who have the right metrics, who have the right goals, they're actually moving forward. You realize actually the end-to-end experience isn't working though, so you hire a bunch of different sub-projects and sub-teams and you coordinate communication between those teams. We almost all make that mistake in these big transformative projects, and you only realize sometime later that you're actually not necessarily solving the complexity, you're managing the complexity. Managing complexity is very different than solving complexity. Managing complexity is a point of time. You're solving it for that number of customers, for that process, and for that experience. What most of us don't realize initially is that because you're just managing the complexity, in some cases you're actually making it even harder to solve the complexity in the future. Because you're managing the complexity that you have in front of you. You're managing the thread ball that you have in front of you. And the more knots you see, the more people you add to solving these knots, creating sub-teams and subgroups and so on and so forth. And most of the time you get to a point, which is the point, at least for me, I realize, hey, maybe we've gone too far, is where you start thinking about the solution is more program management. The solution is more people into the mix to actually untangle that thread. So we've been kind of thinking about support experience at Toast, and we've approached the problem kind of similarly. If you look at the thread ball here, you kind of start seeing the signals of an experience that needs to improve. Wait times, lack of data. We're not really sure when a customer calls who they are and how they're actually, what problems they're facing. We should have actually called them. They should have not called us. You start kind of seeing these types of problems, and you discover, okay, we have a pretty complex problem to solve. Then we broke the problem down, and as we start breaking it down, you realize, okay, we have live chat. You can call a number and you'll get to Toast. But we also have live chat. For example, live chat was too live. If you're not in front of your computer within 5 minutes, we kind of assume you don't need help anymore, and we move on. You can imagine a restaurant environment, that's not great. Authenticating a customer is really difficult in a restaurant environment. People don't go to the phone number that's registered with us and give us a call from that number so we know who they are. They have a problem, it's rush hour, it's lunch rush hour, they pick up the phone that's in their pocket, and they spend the first 5 minutes kind of trying to authenticate themselves and who they are, which is really frustrating, especially both for the customer and for the agent. You have the problem of a knowledge base needs to be up to date all the time, but also customers are running multiple different versions, which means it can't just be up all the time, it also has to be updated for all these different types of software that we have out there. So as you kind of start looking at these problems, our next gut feeling or the next call was, let's make an authentication team, a live chat team, knowledge base team, phone call authentication team, and so on and so forth. Let's divide and conquer on this problem. Here's the issue with that. The first one is you start coming up with siloed solutions. Like the way we authenticate phone will probably be different than the way we authenticate live chat. You start having too much communication required between these teams. You start asking teams who are doing authentication to work really, really closely with the team that's doing knowledge base, because otherwise what we have out there is going to be different than the script that the agent has when they call. You start the farther away you are from the minute you did the customer journey, the less holistic it becomes. So every single day, from the day that the service design team put that journey together, it starts becoming more about how we're running things internally and less about how it's the customer view. And the last piece is you're still delivering a fragmented experience. You're managing complexity. You're not actually solving complexity. You still have a fragmented experience for the duration of all these teams working on these projects. So we kind of paused and said, what if we kind of rethink this support experience piece a little bit differently? And we came up with a method that we call internally control points, but a little bit easier to explain with this, which is how do you pull the thread? How do you pull the thread on the problem you're facing? So if I give you now a thread ball, ball of thread ball, I don't know, ball of thread, and I tell you, hey, like you have the next hour to figure out to untangle it, it's very unlikely that you would ask 5, 6 people around you to start pulling from different direction with you. It's far more likely that you're going to start kind of figuring out where is that thread that's hanging out that you can start pulling. And every time you face a knot, you can untangle it and move on. So how do you find that thread that can help you actually untangle the rest of the ball? And finding it is sometimes really hard, because you look at different pieces and you think it is what you need to look into, and you discover it's actually a really deep thread inside the ball. You just thought it's the one that you can pull. So as we kind of look back on the possible path of defragmenting the experience, and you look at how do we revisit this, one, we can start by looking at what is the thread we need to pull. It's a fragmented experience. How do we look at the key failure points and really understand the journey? Then we skip that step of dividing and conquering, and we go into how do we identify the thread to pull, and I'll share more about how we did this for support. And then how do we take that and actually expand to the end-to-end experience? And in that piece, the customer cohort you start with is really, really important, because you can't start with everybody to start to pull the thread for everybody on that experience. So let's kind of look back at support for us. We were doing incremental progress. The authentication team has actually moved our authentication timeline, or the time it takes to authenticate a customer when they call in from a phone number we don't recognize, by 10-20%, which was huge. If you think about that number and thousands of tickets, that's not nothing. Our live chat team has actually made really good improvements to the process, so we don't drop you off when you're chatting with us. We give you a little bit more time to come back, and if you come back within a certain time, it improves. It improved our customer satisfaction scores and so on. So every team was actually making pretty good improvement, but we were not seeing that in the overall support experience improvement. So as we thought about, okay, what is the thread to pull? I want you to imagine a busy restaurant. This is based on a ton of research, but just for the sake of the next minute, imagine a really busy restaurant, rush hour, 12:30, they're serving food, and the printer in the kitchen goes out. So the whole service is now coming to a halt, unless you have the kitchen display system. But anyway, the whole kind of process stops. So the first thing they're going to do is whomever is in the kitchen, they're going to pick up the phone, and they're going to call. And most of the time, that's the GM of the restaurant, the person that's responsible for that location. Most of the time, that person is on the floor talking to customers. They're in the kitchen trying to move it faster. They're trying to deal with a customer who's unhappy with their food. They're trying to comp a customer for a bad experience. They're all over the place. You're now taking them away from the floor, and you're asking them to sit in the kitchen and pick up a phone number and call. Most of the time, they call from their cell phone. And they spend the next 2-3 minutes authenticating. They can't be on the floor and be on the phone with us because it's really loud. So we can't hear them. They can't hear us. They can't be on the floor while they're waiting. They can't go in and out of the kitchen because that's a really difficult thing for them to deal with. And they now have a bunch of different things that are slowing down because they're on the phone. Depending on the problem, could be 5 minutes, could be 10 minutes, could be 15, could be, hey, you need to reset the printer, it's not connected right. If the printer is broken, we need to send you one. So depending on the problem, could be many different things. And eventually you solve it. But the biggest problem here is I have to be live. As a GM, I have to be live on the phone. I can't be authenticated because most of the time I'm calling from a number we've never seen before. Remember, this is a high turnover industry. So even if we ask you to give us your phone number every time you're a GM of a restaurant, that doesn't guarantee you've done it already. There are potential for wait times because we get the majority of our tickets during 3 times a day, 3 peak hours a day. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It's a restaurant industry. And then knowledge base is not easy to access if you're on the floor. The first reaction of a GM isn't to go and pick up their phone, go to toasttab.com/knowledge base, look at the printer type that they have and read about it a little bit, solve it, and or try to solve it and understand it, especially if they're facing this problem for the first time. So our kind of realization is that async support, and async chat support in particular, is really the threat to pull. Now, this may seem obvious, like we're not the ones to invent async chat support. But it's actually, we really pressure tested, is that actually the threat to pull? Does that help us improve the rest of the experience? Because that may help us to solve the initial piece of the experience, but does that help us actually to untangle the whole threat ball? So we looked at a bunch of things based on kind of the restaurant environment. One is, does it solve the most obvious problems? So authentication, for example. If you're starting from async chat support on our app, we know who you are. We know which location you're looking at. We even know the device that you may be talking about. So that solves that. We can give you quick answers because text is very different than spoken, than phone. We can empower agents better because they're not on the phone. One of the things we heard from agents all the time is it's such a stressful environment to be an agent during rush hour. You're on the phone, there is a GM in your ear as you're trying to understand what the problem is, and every minute of silence is a minute of stress. So that goes away with async chat support. So that was kind of our, OK, we're going to test this out and move in with that theory. So we picked a cohort of customers that was customers who've already used chat support with Toast. So we didn't have to do behavior change yet for the rest of the customer population. And we started with, OK, we're going to offer, this is the Toast app on the phone. And we offered support on the phone. The first thing we realize is actually a bunch of the questions we're getting are pretty simple questions. They're questions that if you looked at the knowledge base, you can solve them. They're not, my printer is broken. It's more like, hey, which config do I need to change to disable online ordering during rush hour? Something that's actually not that difficult for someone who's really experienced with the system. We introduced AI answers. That was the first knot that we were able to kind of untangle, which is a percentage of tickets can now be solved with AI directly. They never get to an agent. The customer is happy because they get their answer within 10 seconds or less. The agent's happy because they can focus more on more deep problems that have been trained to deal with. Then we realized actually we extended that to the agents. So now agents, because it's written, we can give them AI assistance as they deal with figuring out what the answer should look like. They have the restaurant information. They have the problem. It's not a problem that AI could have solved. We know that. So now it's going to an agent. So the agent now has an experience in front of them where they can ask AI questions that uses all the data we have internally to help solve it. That's the other knot. Then what we realize is we can use this to help improve our knowledge base. Because every time a customer says, that AI answer you gave me didn't work, I need an agent, that's a moment of improvement for our knowledge base. Every time the agent looks up for that answer and it doesn't help, that's a moment we can improve our knowledge base. The knowledge exists somewhere. It's just not accessible to either the customer or the agent. So our knowledge base became a more useful experience for customers because we were kind of pulling the thread on what part of our knowledge is not good enough. And then, oh, that one is already there. And then with that, we had the ability to intelligently route tickets in ways we can't do on the phone. So you're able to train a much smaller number of agents on really deep expertise in certain areas because you know where to route which problem. And you can imagine the more you poll, the more you discover. But basically, these improvements, if you look at them, they're not async chat support exclusive. Improving our knowledge base is for everybody. Providing AI assistant for agents is for all. We were able to roll it out to all agents. AI chat answers could be available publicly to customers without having to go through this experience. So even though we started with async chat support, we were improving the whole how do I get help process. And the more we pulled the thread, the more we were able to do. So here are the 3 questions. If you can think of a single problem today that you're kind of dealing with that's transformative enough, so large enough, that could be, could have been multiple projects. Here are the 3 questions kind of looking back that I would have asked. The first one is, do you actually deeply understand where the pain in today's experience is. Most of the time, as we kind of look back at the experiences, we haven't done the work to deeply understand, using service design and rigorous research, what does the end-to-end journey actually look like? So you have to understand what the pain points are for you to be able to actually decide what is the thread to pull. And if not, then you need to spend the time. If you don't have this readily available, then you need to spend the time. The second one is, do you have a primary avenue that works? For us, that was the app. For you, that could be, your product, that could be a web experience, that could be an app, that could be a phone, that could be, there are multiple different ways to connect with customers. But the reason, for us, for example, the reason the app was a primary avenue versus our web portal, versus our phone, versus anything else is you're authenticated, it's in your pocket, we can reach out to you anytime we want. So when it's async, we have to get back to you. We get your full attention to some extent. It has camera and video, so we can quickly, if it's a printer issue, we can quickly start debugging with you live. All these things don't necessarily exist in other avenues. So do you have the right primary avenue? And if not, you may need to go create it. You may need to start with, we actually don't have the right connection point with customers to even solve this problem. And then the last piece is, do you have a clear user cohort to start with? For us, it was customers who have already used chat support. So we had a group of customers within Toast who use Toast, who have already had this experience, so that we don't have to start from scratch on doing behavior training. We had a small cohort of customers, or relatively small cohort of customers, that is significant enough, but small enough where we can do a lot of experimentation with that primary avenue for us to move forward. And we only released to that cohort of customers initially, by the way. And by the way, not just a cohort of customers, but a cohort of agents who knew how to do chat support, and who knew how to do async chat support, who knew how to get back to an issue 2, 3, 4 hours later, and still be connected to that customer and show empathy through writing and all of these things that are important. In support, again, we discovered the clear need for async support. I think of the kind of what the restaurants look like. We actually spent a year creating Toast Now, which is the app. I didn't go through that too much, but we realized actually we don't have a primary avenue with customers that we can do this. So our first step was we created a direct connection point, and we provided independent value so people use it, so they can later use it for support. So it became their in their pocket reporting app that they use it all the time. So when we introduced support, it was a natural progression on how do we connect with customers. And then we started with app users who've already used chat support. So a cohort of customers who's engaged, ready, done this before, and we can experiment, or like they're ready for experimentation because we're not changing their behavior at the same time that we're asking them to try a new thing. We've rolled this out to all customers. I think I can say that. We've rolled out to all customers recently, last week or so. We've been testing this for a few months. We rolled this out to all customers recently, and the response from customers has been awesome. Both customers and agents, by the way. We tracked a few metrics for this, but the two key metrics we track is customer satisfaction, which is much higher for this experience, and then we track agent satisfaction. Are agents happy? And it's much higher for this experience. This is the kind of like the holy grail of a support experience. Are agents happy? Are customers happy? Because if you have one or the other, it's likely going to break eventually. It's managed complexity versus solved complexity. We're scaling this approach. We're going to use it for how we do onboarding, how we do our connection directly with employees of the restaurant, which we're working on. How do we do connection directly with the guests of the restaurant? So all of these things on how do we pull the thread and where do we start? So what's the right thread to pull if you have a challenge that you're thinking about? And I have 22 seconds to spare. Thank you. How are you?
Nicely done.
Thank you.
Man, I mean, it's kind of a mic drop on day one. I don't even know why I'm up here. In all seriousness, like what you presented, like how long of an approximation of time did that represent?
I would say 12 to 18 months.
Okay.
From the time we kind of realized this is a really important problem for us to solve to the time where we rolled out to all customers. Lots of stages in between.
Yeah.
So for example, the app on its own has been immensely helpful for customers, regardless of whether it has support or not. But it has given us the opportunity to actually have a direct connection with customers and improve the experience there. Then with support, we had to scale really carefully. So we're able to scale the number of agents with the number of customers and scale the number of products we support using this experience with the different cohorts of customers that we add. So we scaled carefully across the board, but I would say 12 to 18 months.
12 to 18 months from like the initial brief to
From
actual like
Red Bull.
production code.
Yeah. It's available to our customers today.
That's fantastic. And then like how many developers were involved in that effort?
So it depends. For the app, it's 4 to 6. And then we have a small team of folks on the R&D side that's focused entirely on support experience, maybe three to 5 people, and then obviously an awesome team on the care side that does the hard work of solving customer problems.
Yeah, they're kind of they're the PagerDuty crew.
The customer-facing teams that actually are solving these problems on a daily basis.
Yeah. So really, at the end of the day, what that does is it enables somebody like Jehad to get up on this lovely stage and take credit for all of their work.
I have the privilege of representing the work
There
of
you
so
go.
many folks at Toast.
Nice. It's a privilege.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, let's see here. We got a congrats. How did you reprioritize the teamwork and the roadmap?
So because we started, I'll kind of answer the app separately from support for just a minute.
Awesome.
For the app, it was a bet. So we took a very small group of people, 2 to 3 people at the time, and we made a bet based on that vision that if we do this, then we can transform multiple different things. And we had milestones for how far we go. We released very early with what we call customer advisory board customers. So 20, 30 people who we work really closely with. And the team was literally on WhatsApp messages with these customers. So we were iterating every single day with them. Once we've proven kind of the traction with that group, then it became much easier to say, okay, this is the right bet for us to make, and we scaled from there. And then once we've made that bet, then it became a little bit easier to say, hey, we need to reprioritize some of the work of the customer success team to focus on this. The more kind of you untangled, the more folks are interested in helping pull harder on the thread.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I'm keeping the metaphor going. But
I like what you did there. Yeah. And then, like, are you going to be able to keep the band together? Like, is this team moving on and like taking on another large challenge in the business? What does that look like from a teaming perspective?
Yeah, we're taking what we've learned from this experience and we're applying it to multiple different areas of the business. Onboarding is an example. We're taking the learnings we've done, especially on AI, and we're kind of expanding that in a different direction on the product side as well. But that initial group of people remains working on this effort and related efforts to it.
With their matching jackets.
Yes. Yes.
I mean,
You have to.
I'm assuming that's just part of the deal.
Of course. Yes.
Right. And then, tactically speaking, were there moments when you had executives come in and kind of flip the table or pound their fist and look for like an initial finding because they had made that capital investment?
Yeah, I think the hardest thing about this method is it seems initially slower than putting 10 teams on 10 different problems and having them all go at the same time, because you get one of the biggest things that teams struggle with is measuring outcomes over outputs and then activity over or productivity over activity. Ooh. And there's a lot of activity.
Like that one.
Yeah. There are a lot of activity in 10 teams working at the same time. They report the green and yellow and red, and like it just looks great. But the reality is they're actually not making as much progress in the long term. So the biggest piece here is finding the executive sponsor who can keep the focus on just continuing to pull the thread. Initially, it's pretty slow. You have to understand the problem. You have to try a few things. You have to try it with a very small number of customers. You can screw up the existing system and so on. But the faster you pull, the more people realize, okay, this is working. So I would say maybe the first 6 months, being really stubborn on the vision, really flexible with the details matters a ton.
Yeah, it doesn't sound stressful at all.
No, it's great.
No. Jehad, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. I appreciate it.
Thank you.